The morning after Gerald Thornbury's death dawned grey and uninviting, the sort of morning that makes one grateful for hot tea and sympathetic companionship. Miss Marple had slept poorly, her mind circling around that bent porch board like a cat circling a cushion, unable to settle into comfort. She rose early, as was her habit, and after a modest breakfast of toast and marmalade, she dressed with particular care in her best charcoal wool dress, the one she wore when she meant to be taken seriously by those who might otherwise dismiss her as merely a pleasant old lady with nothing of consequence to contribute. The village, she knew, would be abuzz with speculation and gossip, and though she had no intention of inserting herself into the official investigation, Inspector Blackwood was not the sort of man who welcomed amateur observations. She felt a certain obligation to understand what had actually occurred, if only to satisfy her own sense of propriety about truth and its representation. The High Street presented the usual morning activity, though notably more animated than such domestic routine typically warranted. Mrs. Pettigrew, who kept the post office, stood in animated conversation with the vicar's wife outside the grocer's shop, and though Miss Marple did not approach them directly, she observed the intensity of their gestures and the particular way Mrs. Pettigrew's lips moved in that rapid-fire fashion that indicated the sharing of information previously unknown to her audience. Young Timothy Ashford, Judith's eldest son, was helping to move some broken railing sections that had been removed from Thornfield Manor, stacking them into a wagon with movements that suggested controlled effort rather than casual labor. He was a boy of perhaps 23, recently returned from university, known to be something of a disappointment to his mother due to his apparent lack of clear ambition or direction in life. The concentration he brought to his current task seemed, Miss Marple thought, somewhat at odds with his usual demeanor of vague distraction. By noon, Miss Marple had made her way to the vicarage, where the vicar's wife, Mrs. Hartwell, received her in the sitting room with the kind relief that suggests a welcome interruption to worry. They had been acquainted for more than 30 years, long enough that Mrs. Hartwell felt no compunction about speaking frankly to Miss Marple, and long enough that Miss Marple had learned to listen with the particular attention to detail that Mrs. Hartwell's gossiping possessed, for though gossip is frequently dismissed as mere chatter, it is often the most accurate record of human behavior and motivation that one can find in any community. Mrs. Hartwell poured tea with slightly shaking hands, and immediately launched into the events of the previous afternoon, with the thoroughness of someone who had replayed them repeatedly in her mind. She had been among the first to reach the porch after the screams, she explained, and she could attest that the railing had indeed broken. One could see quite clearly where it had given way. But what troubled Mrs. Hartwell, and what she shared with Miss Marple in that hushed tone reserved for matters that one feels ought not be discussed but cannot help but be discussed, was that Gerald Thornbury had not been alone on that balcony. This detail, Miss Marple noted, seemed to have escaped the official investigation, or at least had not been emphasized in any of the accounts she had heard. According to Mrs. Hartwell, who had spoken to the upstairs maid at Thornfield, one of the house guests had been seen entering the manor through the front entrance at approximately the time of the fall, a detail that would not be remarkable, except for the fact that this particular house guest was Robert Ashford, Judith's brother, who had been observed by no fewer than 3 people to have been in the garden at the moment of the accident. The contradiction seemed neither remarkable nor troubling to most people, Mrs. Hartwell suggested, but she herself found it curious, as did the maid, who had mentioned it almost parenthetically, as though the detail carried no weight whatsoever. Yet weight, Miss Marple understood, was frequently a matter of perspective. The conversation continued with the sort of gentle redirecting that Miss Marple had perfected over decades of careful listening. She extracted further information about Gerald Thornbury himself, a widower of some 15 years, a man known to be financially successful and not particularly generous with his success, a man whose relationships with the village were cordial but distant, like those of someone visiting a place rather than truly inhabiting it. She learned that he had been staying at Thornfield Manor as a guest for the past week, having come to discuss some matter of estate settlement with Judith Ashford, a matter that involved the disposition of certain properties and their associated legal complications. She learned also that there had been, according to village speculation, some tension between Gerald and Robert Ashford regarding these very matters. Though Mrs. Hartwell could not say with certainty what the nature of this tension involved, as Miss Marple departed the vicarage in the early afternoon, her mind began to construct the delicate framework upon which mysteries are built. Not assumptions precisely, but rather the recognition of inconsistencies between what people said had occurred and what the physical evidence suggested might truly have transpired. The bent porch board, the question of Robert Ashford's whereabouts, the matter of estate settlement that had brought Gerald Thornbury to the manor, and the curious detail that a man falling from a considerable height somehow possessed the presence of mind to release his walking stick in such a manner that it landed several feet away from his body. These details, individually, might mean nothing whatsoever, but collectively, they suggested that the accident which everyone had accepted so readily might in fact be something considerably more deliberate than anyone had yet considered. The constable assigned to take formal statements at Thornfield Manor was a young man named Davies, earnest and methodical in his approach, but possessed of that particular quality of selective perception that comes from being taught to look for specific things and therefore missing everything else entirely. He had established himself in the morning room on the day following the death, and one by one the members of the household and the remaining guests presented themselves to give their accounts of the previous afternoon. Miss Marple had arranged, through the gentle mechanism of mentioning to Mrs. Hartwell that she feared the household must be in considerable distress, and that perhaps she might offer some assistance with correspondence and domestic matters, to be present at Thornfield Manor in a capacity that was neither quite official nor entirely unofficial. A position of useful invisibility that her years had taught her was the most advantageous from which to observe human behavior. She occupied herself with organizing flowers in the entrance hall while remaining within earshot of the morning room, a task that allowed her to appear occupied while being, in reality, engaged in the most serious attention to what transpired within. Judith Ashford was questioned first, and her account was straightforward and apparently without guile. She had been in the garden with her guests during the fete, she explained to Constable Davies, and had heard the screams that announced the tragedy. She had not seen the fall itself, had not observed Gerald ascending to the second-floor balcony, indeed had not been particularly aware of his movements in the latter part of the afternoon. The railing, she confirmed, had been in questionable repair. She had been meaning to have it attended to for some months now, but with the expense of maintaining a house of Thornfield's size, one learned to prioritize one's renovations. Yes, Gerald had been a guest for approximately 1 week. Yes, there had been business of an estate nature to discuss. No, nothing of any consequence that might have agitated anyone to violence, merely the tiresome details of property settlement that were the province of solicitors, and the tedious sorts of legal matters that required attention when one inherited property from relatives one scarcely knew. Robert Ashford's statement, when he gave it some hours later, was similarly straightforward but possessed of a quality that caused Miss Marple to pause in her arrangement of dahlias and listen with particular care. He confirmed that he had been in the garden, that he had observed nothing of the fall, that he had heard the screams along with everyone else. When questioned about being seen entering the house at approximately the time of the accident, he admitted with a slight hesitation that, yes, he had gone inside briefly. He had wanted to retrieve a book from the library that he had been reading, finding the afternoon light in the garden less suitable for reading than he had anticipated. The timing was unfortunate, he acknowledged, but purely coincidental. Constable Davies seemed to accept this explanation without particular scrutiny, making a notation in his small book and moving forward in his questions with the satisfied air of someone who has eliminated a potential complication. What was most revealing, however, was what was not stated, and Miss Marple had spent 60 years learning to listen to silences as carefully as she listened to words. Neither Judith nor Robert had mentioned the specific nature of the property settlement that Gerald had come to discuss, and neither had been asked to elaborate. Indeed, Constable Davies appeared to have no interest whatsoever in the business that had brought Gerald Thornbury to Thornfield Manor, treating it as mere backdrop rather than as the potential motive that even the most inexperienced investigator might have recognized it to be. When Timothy Ashford was called to give his statement, Miss Marple found herself deliberately taking longer with the flowers, positioning herself where she might observe his expression as well as hear his words. Timothy was nervous, displaying the kind of controlled anxiety that suggested he had something on his mind that he was determined not to reveal. He had been in the garden, he stated, helping with the refreshment table. He had not seen Gerald enter the house. He had not observed anything unusual. His answers were brief and seemed designed to convey as little information as possible, and Constable Davies, perhaps noting the young man's obvious discomfort, seemed inclined to conclude the interview quickly rather than to probe deeper. As Timothy departed the morning room, he passed near Miss Marple in the hallway, and she observed with the precision that long practice had developed in her that his hands were trembling slightly, and that there was a small cut on his left palm, the sort of wound that might be several hours old or might be fresh. It was difficult to determine with certainty, but it was there nonetheless, and it was. The sort of small detail that most people would not notice, and most people would not connect to anything of significance. By late afternoon, when Constable Davies had concluded his interviews and departed with the apparent satisfaction of someone who had performed his duties competently, if uncreatively, Miss Marple found herself with the opportunity to examine the balcony more closely. She climbed the stairs with careful deliberation, aware that her movements might be observed and must appear entirely innocent. The balcony was cordoned off with police tape, but the tape had been applied in a manner that was more formal than truly restrictive. She stood at the threshold and examined the broken railing with the eye of someone who has spent a lifetime understanding how things break, how wood fails, and what patterns of deterioration and damage tell about the forces that have acted upon them. The break was irregular, which was consistent with age and sudden stress, but the bent porch board below, that was the detail that returned to her as she stood there, and she allowed herself to wonder, very carefully and without permitting the thought to crystallize into certainty, whether it had been bent by a body falling from above, or whether it had been bent by someone deliberately, carefully, methodically, in preparation for the very tragedy that had occurred. The inquest was scheduled for the following Tuesday, a matter of formality that was expected to conclude within a few hours with a verdict of accidental death. The coroner, Dr. Whitley, was a man of considerable experience but also of considerable habit, and his habit was to move swiftly through cases that presented no obvious complications or mysteries requiring deeper investigation. The medical evidence supported the theory of accidental death. Gerald Thornbury's injuries were consistent with a fall from considerable height. HT onto hard ground, the toxicology results showed the presence of alcohol in his system. The railing was demonstrably unstable. Everything aligned perfectly with the narrative that had been established from the very first moment of the tragedy, and yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly aware of the peculiar sensation that arises when one observes a puzzle whose pieces fit together too neatly, too smoothly, without the irregularities that characterize most genuine accidents and genuine human behavior. She decided, with the quiet determination that had guided her through 60 years of observation and gentle investigation, that she would attend the inquest not as a passive observer, but as an active listener, alert to what was said and, more importantly, to what was conspicuously absent from the proceedings. On the Monday preceding the inquest, Miss Marple paid a visit to the local solicitor's office, that small establishment housed above the chemist's shop on the High Street, where Gerald Thornbury had maintained his practice for the better part of 30 years. His junior partner, a younger man named Collins who had been associated with the firm for approximately 5 years, was in the process of settling affairs and managing the transition of clientele to other practitioners. He received Miss Marple with the kind of polite reserve that people typically extended to elderly ladies who appeared to have no particular reason for visiting a solicitor's office. But Miss Marple had found over the years that this reserve could be overcome through the simple mechanism of expressing interest in his own circumstances and well-being. Within 20 minutes of conversation that appeared to ramble from topic to topic with the disconnected quality of elderly ladies' discourse, she had managed to extract a considerable quantity of information regarding Gerald Thornbury's recent act, activities and state of mind. Collins, it appeared, had been troubled by his senior partner's behavior in recent weeks. Gerald had been unusually preoccupied, had spent considerable time on a matter involving the Ashford estate and had, on at least one occasion, expressed frustration with what he described as certain complications that had arisen regarding the disposition of properties held in trust. When Miss Marple inquired, with the appearance of idle curiosity, whether these complications involved disputes among the Ashford family members, Collins hesitated, clearly constrained by professional discretion, but his hesitation itself was informative. He could not speak to the specifics, he explained, but he could say that Gerald had seemed particularly concerned about ensuring that certain individuals were not in a position to act against the interests of the trust. The implication was clear enough to someone of Miss Marple's perceptiveness, though she affected not to notice it, instead shifting the conversation to pleasantries about the weather and the difficulty of managing complicated estates. As she departed the office, she carried with her the understanding that the property settlement that had brought Gerald Thornbury to Thornfield Manor was not merely a matter of routine administration, but involved something that Gerald had deemed important enough to express concern about to his junior partner. Concern sufficient that he had been preoccupied enough for his younger colleague to notice and remember. The evening before the inquest, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Timothy Ashford appeared at her cottage door with the appearance of someone who had been deliberating about this action for some time, and had only just gathered sufficient courage to act upon the decision. He was pale and somewhat agitated, and Miss Marple, observing his state with the accuracy of long practice, understood that he was laboring under the weight of information that he felt obligated to share, but was uncertain whether sharing it would create more complications than it resolved. She invited him in with the gentle hospitality that made people feel safe confiding in her, and he accepted with the grateful acceptance of someone who is relieved to have the decision to speak taken partially out of his own hands. He sat in the small sitting room with the stiff posture of profound discomfort, and, after several false starts and incomplete sentences, finally revealed the substance of what was troubling him. Gerald Thornbury, it appeared, had discovered something in the course of his review of the estate documents, something that involved the manner in which certain properties had been transferred and the precise legal status of Timothy's inheritance in relation to his mother's control of the estate. Timothy could not articulate the exact nature of the complication, but he understood that Gerald had determined that Judith Ashford had, whether intentionally or through negligent error, been managing estate properties in a manner that was inconsistent with the trust documents that governed them. Gerald had apparently informed Timothy of this discovery with the apparent intention of giving the young man an opportunity to address the matter before proceeding with formal legal action. What Timothy was attempting to convey, though his embarrassment and conflicted loyalty made the communication difficult, was that his mother had been exceedingly distressed when she learned of Gerald's findings, and that there had been several heated conversations between them regarding what Gerald intended to do and what his actions might mean for the family's financial circumstances. Miss Marple listened to all of this with the attentive silence that made people feel heard and understood, and when Timothy departed some time later, having apparently unburdened himself of information that had been weighing upon him considerably, she sat alone in her cottage with her knitting, and allowed the various pieces of the puzzle to rearrange themselves in her mind. The picture that emerged was not one of simple accident, but of complicated motive, and she understood with the clarity that came from understanding human nature that she would need to attend the inquest not merely as an observer, but as someone prepared to gently suggest to the appropriate authorities that the matter might warrant deeper investigation than had thus far been undertaken. The inquest convened on Tuesday morning in the small courtroom that served St. Mary Mead and the surrounding villages, a room that had witnessed countless minor legal proceedings, but rarely one involving the death of a prominent local figure. The coroner, Dr. Whitley, was a man of approximately 65 years, with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested he had conducted hundreds of such inquiries and saw no reason why this one should deviate from the established pattern. The jury consisted of 12 local men, all of whom appeared to possess that particular quality of respectful attention that suggests they understand their civic duty without necessarily comprehending its true significance. Inspector Blackwood sat near the front. his notebook before him, his expression one of satisfied certainty that the matter would be concluded expeditiously. Miss Marple occupied a seat in the back of the courtroom, her appearance the very picture of an elderly lady attending civic proceedings out of vague civic interest, though her eyes missed nothing, and her attention was as focused as a surgeon's scalpel. The first witness called was the upstairs maid at Thornfield Manor, a young woman named Ellen, whose testimony established that she had observed Gerald ascending to the second floor at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that she had seen him enter the room that adjoined the balcony in question, and that she had heard no cries of alarm until approximately 1 hour later. Her account was straightforward and uncontentious, and the coroner seemed satisfied with her evidence. The next witness was a gardener employed by the Ashford family, who testified to the state of disrepair of the railing, describing in particular detail the manner in which the wood had rotted from the inside out, how certain sections had become dangerously weak, and how he had repeatedly advised that the matter required urgent attention. His testimony appeared to conclusively establish the state of the balcony and its readiness to give way under sudden stress. Dr. Whitley then presented the medical evidence, speaking in that precise terminology that medical examiners employ when addressing juries. The injuries sustained by Gerald Thornbury were entirely consistent with a fall from the second floor. The time of death had occurred within the window, that corresponded with the observed timing of the screams and the discovery of the body, and the presence of alcohol in the system suggested that judgment might have been impaired. All of this was presented with the clinical certainty of someone who saw nothing in the evidence that contradicted the obvious conclusion. Inspector Blackwood, when called to present his findings, added very little of substance. He confirmed that the balcony railing had been examined and found to be in poor condition, that there were no signs of struggle or foul play, that the death appeared to be accidental in nature. He presented his case with the brisk confidence of someone who has solved the puzzle to his own satisfaction and sees no need for further investigation. It was at this point, as the coroner was preparing to address the jury and guide them toward the inevitable conclusion, that Miss Marple raised her hand with the gentle diffidence that characterized all her actions. The coroner, mildly surprised by this interruption from a member of the public gallery, inquired whether she had information relevant to the proceedings. Miss Marple rose slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, and addressed the court with the kind of humble deference that made her words seem less like accusations than like gentle suggestions born of concerned observation. She had been present at the fête on the afternoon in question, she explained, and she had observed a detail that had troubled her sufficiently that she felt obligated to bring it to the attention of the court, though she fully acknowledged that it might mean nothing whatsoever and that she was merely an elderly lady with perhaps an overactive tendency toward noticing small things. The detail in question, she explained, concerned the bent porch board upon which Gerald Thornbury's body had been discovered. She had observed, upon examining the board with her own eyes, that the bending appeared to be not of the sort that would naturally result from a body striking it after a fall from considerable height, but rather seemed more consistent with deliberate bending or compression applied from above, the sort of bending that might occur if someone had attempted to weaken a structural support or had applied pressure to test its stability. Furthermore, she continued in her gentle, almost apologetic tone, she had observed in the course of conversations with various members of the household that the walking stick which Gerald had been holding at the time of his fall had landed at a considerable distance from the body, a phenomenon that seemed curious given the typical behavior of objects in such circumstance. Most curiously of all, she ventured to suggest, the timing of Robert Ashford's entry into the house, which had been explained as a simple desire to retrieve a book, seemed worth examining more carefully, particularly given that the book in question had not been recovered from his person or from the library, where he had allegedly gone to fetch it. The courtroom fell silent in that particular way that silence falls when something unexpected has disrupted the comfortable flow of proceedings that were approaching their anticipated conclusion. The coroner's expression shifted from satisfied certainty to something more attentive and considerably less comfortable. Inspector Blackwood sat up straighter, his previous confidence replaced by the awareness that he had perhaps missed something significant. The jury members exchanged glances, and suddenly the matter that had seemed so conclusively settled appeared, through the mechanism of 3 simple observations delivered in the most gentle and apologetic tone, to require considerably more careful examination than it had thus far received. Miss Marple resumed her seat with the appearance of having merely made a passing observation of no great consequence, while the coroner postponed the conclusion of proceedings and requested that Inspector Blackwood conduct a more thorough investigation into the matters that the elderly lady had so graciously brought to their attention. The postponement of the inquest's conclusion created a peculiar state of suspended animation in St. Mary Mead, the kind of prolonged uncertainty that causes communities to become unusually introspective and unusually prone to examining the behavior and circumstances of their members with an intensity that had previously been absent. Inspector Blackwood, stung somewhat by the implication that his investigation had been insufficiently thorough, threw himself in to a more rigorous examination of the evidence with the determination of a man whose professional competence had been, however gently and however indirectly, called into question. He returned to Thornfield Manor with a team that included a more senior detective inspector from the county constabulary, a woman named Margaret Winters, who possessed the kind of sharp analytical mind that recognized anomalies where others saw only confirmation of established theories. Within 48 hours of their renewed investigation, several matters that had previously been overlooked began to emerge into clarity, and Miss Marple, who had returned to her cottage and resumed the ordinary rhythms of her life with apparent unconcern, found herself receiving a visitor in the form of Inspector Winters, who had learned through inquiries that the elderly lady in question possessed a reputation in St. Mary Mead for understanding human behavior with unusual accuracy. Inspector Winters was not the sort of woman to be dismissive of older ladies, having learned through long experience that age frequently brought with it an accumulated wisdom that formal training could not entirely replicate. She came to Miss Marple's cottage with the genuine gratitude of someone who has been given a crucial insight and wishes to understand the mechanism by which that insight had been achieved. Miss Marple received her with tea, and the kind of gentle hospitality that made conversations feel less like interrogations than like consultations between colleagues, though Miss Marple was careful never to represent herself in any such capacity. Inspector Winters explained that the renewed investigation had uncovered several matters of considerable interest. The walking stick, when examined more carefully, showed signs of having been deliberately thrown, rather than having fallen naturally from Gerald's hand. The position in which it had landed, combined with the absence of any evidence that he had been holding it at the moment of impact, suggested that it had been released with intentional force from above, precisely as Miss Marple had suggested might be the case. Furthermore, the examination of the porch board had revealed that certain fibers found beneath it appeared to be consistent with rope or cord, fibers that had not been present in any quantity one would expect from the natural deterioration of the wood itself. Most significantly, Detective Inspector Winters explained, the investigation into Robert Ashford's movements at the time of the accident had revealed that no book matching the description he had provided had ever been retrieved from the library. And in fact, the library had been examined and no evidence of his presence there could be discovered. When confronted with this discrepancy, Robert had become evasive, eventually admitting that he had not actually gone to retrieve a book at all, but had gone upstairs to meet with Gerald Thornbury in the privacy of the second-floor room, having arranged this meeting in advance through a note delivered during the fete. The nature of this meeting, when finally extracted through careful questioning, involved a heated conversation regarding the estate settlement and certain financial arrangements that Robert had hoped to have adjusted in his favor. Robert claimed that their discussion had remained verbal, that Gerald had refused his requests, and that he had departed the room and returned downstairs without incident. However, the timing of his return and the circumstances of Gerald's subsequent fall created a window of perhaps 10 to 15 minutes in which Robert's movements could not be accounted for by any witnesses. Miss Marple listened to all of this with careful attention, and, when Inspector Winters had concluded her explanatio, ventured a gentle observation that seemed to crystallize the detective's growing suspicion. Had Inspector Winters, Miss Marple inquired, examined whether the railing had been deliberately weakened prior to the moment of Gerald's fall, rather than having given way under the simple stress of an accident? The detective's eyes narrowed with the kind of focused attention that suggested the possibility had been considered but not yet fully explored. Miss Marple then proceeded to explain, in her gentle and almost tentative manner, that she had observed in Timothy Ashford's hand a cut that appeared to be consistent with the kind of injury one might sustain from handling rough wood while attempting to weaken structural supports, and that she had noted a certain unusual tension between Robert Ashford and his younger cousin that suggested they might not be entirely unconnected in their interests and motivations. Furthermore, she mentioned almost parenthetically, she had observed in conversation with the head gardener that he had mentioned finding rope and certain tools in an unusual location near the balcony on the morning following the death, tools that had not been there during his regular morning rounds on the day of the accident itself. Inspector Winters departed Miss Marple's cottage with a series of new directions to investigate, and within another 48 hours, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together with the kind of clarity that comes when one stops searching for simple explanations and begins to consider the possibility of deliberate design. Robert Ashford, when confronted with the evidence of premeditation, initially maintained his innocence, but the discovery in his room of sketches and notes regarding the structural integrity of the balcony railing proved difficult to explain away. The rope fibers beneath the porch board corresponded to rope discovered in Timothy's possession, rope that showed evidence of having been used to create a deliberate failure mechanism beneath the board itself. Timothy, when questioned separately, eventually broke under the weight of evidence and emotional distress, admitting that Robert had enlisted his help in creating the appearance of an accident, promising that the financial benefits that would accrue to Timothy from the rearrangement of estate properties following his mother's freedom from legal complications would be substantial. The conspiracy had been constructed with considerable care, designed to appear as nothing more than the inevitable result of neglect and age, and it had succeeded until Miss Marple's gentle observations had caused someone to look more carefully at what had been presented as obvious truth. The formal charges were laid against Robert Ashford on a grey Thursday morning, and the village learned of the arrest through the mechanism that all villages employ for the dissemination of important information. That is to say, through Mrs. Pettigrew at the post office, who had observed the police vehicles arriving at Thornfield Manor with her usual keen attention to detail, and had wasted no time in ensuring that the substance of events was comprehensively distributed throughout St. Mary Mead by the time the clock tower struck 10:30. The news created a peculiar sensation, the sort of disturbance that occurs when a community's comfortable assumptions about its members are suddenly and irrevocably challenged. Robert Ashford had been, by all accounts, a pleasant enough young man, a visitor of no particular notoriety, and the revelation that he had deliberately orchestrated the death of another human being with the cold calculation that the evidence suggested seemed to violate something fundamental about the order of things. People struggled to reconcile the smiling figure they had observed at the garden fete with the individual who had, according to the police investigation, spent weeks planning a murder designed to appear as accident, and the struggle created in them that peculiar discomfort that comes from understanding that human nature is far more complex and far more capable of deception than one wishes it to be. Judith Ashford withdrew from the social life of St. Mary Mead almost entirely, remaining within the confines of Thornfield Manor with a kind of profound isolation that suggested she was attempting to process not only the death of a man who had been her guest, but the revelation that her own brother had orchestrated that death for reasons connected to financial gain that would have benefited her through the resolution of legal complications in her favor. Whether she had known in advance of Robert's intentions remained unclear, and Inspector Winters conducted a thorough investigation into her knowledge and involvement that ultimately concluded that Judith had been genuinely ignorant of the conspiracy, though this ignorance did nothing to mitigate the social ostracism that began to accumulate around her. The property settlement that had been the catalyst for the entire matter was thrown into considerable legal complication by Gerald's death, creating precisely the kind of confusion and delay that might have been prevented had Gerald been permitted to live and complete the work that he had undertaken. Timothy Ashford, broken by the confession he had made and the understanding of how thoroughly he had been manipulated by his cousin, withdrew from the village with his mother's permission and entered into a period of what might be characterized as cautious rehabilitation. His youth counted in his favor in the eyes of the legal system, and the prosecution's investigation suggested that while his involvement had been significant, his role had been secondary to Robert's, and his participation had been motivated by a combination of naivete regarding the seriousness of what was being contemplated and a genuine belief that the financial benefits that would accrue were not only real but justified by circumstances he did not fully understand. The court, in its eventual judgment, reflected this understanding, though not without, censuring his behavior and making clear that collaboration in deliberate wrongdoing could not be excused by youth or incomplete understanding. It was nearly 3 weeks after the initial discovery of Gerald Thornbury's body that Miss Marple received a visitor of quite unexpected character. Inspector Winters arrived at her cottage on a cool afternoon with the appearance of someone who had come to conduct business of a personal rather than professional nature. She carried with her a small package and a letter, the latter of which she presented to Miss Marple with an expression that suggested gratification mixed with something approximating bewilderment. The letter, Miss Marple discovered upon opening it, was from Gerald Thornbury's solicitor, written before Gerald's death and addressed to be opened in the event of his demise. The letter expressed Gerald's conviction that certain individuals at Thornfield Manor harbored intentions toward him that were not benevolent, and it contained a detailed account of the financial irregularities he had discovered in the estate management, along with his belief that these irregularities might be connected to his own safety. The letter further contained Gerald's observation that he had observed an elderly lady at the garden fete whose expression and manner of attention suggested a perceptiveness that exceeded that of most observers, and that should anything occur to him, he had some confidence that this particular elderly lady might be capable of understanding the truth beneath whatever false narrative might be constructed to conceal it. Miss Marple received this information with the kind of composed grace that suggested she was neither surprised by it nor particularly moved by its implications. She thanked Inspector Winters for bringing it to her attention and remarked that it was curious how often the truth, when properly examined, could be discovered by anyone willing to look carefully at what was actually present rather than accepting what was expected to be there. Inspector Winters, departing some time later, carried with her the understanding that the elderly lady in question possessed a quality of insight that transcended mere observation and entered into the realm of something approaching genuine wisdom about the nature of human motivation and behavior. The package that had accompanied the letter contained a collection of small objects that Gerald had apparently gathered in the days preceding his death: sketches of the balcony railing, notes regarding conversations with Timothy, observations about the behavior of various household members that suggested he had been considerably more aware of the conspiracy being constructed around him than anyone had initially realized. These materials were turned over to the legal authorities as evidence, though they were ultimately superfluous to the case that had already been so thoroughly established through other means. What was significant was the picture they painted of a man who had recognized danger in his environment, but had not anticipated the precise form that danger would take, and who had therefore made the crucial error of remaining in proximity to those who wished him harm, while expecting that the legal system and public order would ultimately protect him from the consequences of their malevolence. The trial of Robert Ashford occupied the attention of the county for the better part of 6 weeks, the proceedings conducted with that particular formality that the English legal system brings to matters of significant crime and significant consequence. The courtroom was filled each day with observers drawn from the surrounding villages, people who had known Robert Ashford or his family, or who simply possessed that morbid fascination with criminal proceedings that seems to be a fundamental characteristic of human nature. The evidence presented was thorough and damning, constructed with the kind of methodical precision that Detective Inspector Winters had brought to her investigation. The rope fibers, the sketches, the notes, the testimony of witnesses regarding movements and timing, all of it accumulated into a narrative so comprehensive and so irrefutable that Robert's defense, conducted by a barrister of some competence but limited options, seemed almost to acknowledge the futility of the enterprise from the outset. Robert himself maintained a demeanor throughout the proceedings that oscillated between defiant assertion of his right to inherit what he believed to be rightfully his, and moments of apparent despair at the understanding that his carefully constructed plan had been so thoroughly dismantled by the simple observation of an elderly lady at a garden party. Miss Marple attended the trial on a single occasion, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom with the appearance of vague interest rather than invested concern. She observed Robert's behavior with the same careful attention that she had brought to observing him at Thornfield Manor, and she noted with the precision of long practice the moments in which his composure fractured, the instances in which his carefully constructed righteousness gave way to something more raw and more revealing. When their eyes met for a single moment across the courtroom, Robert appeared to recognize in her the source of his undoing, and his expression conveyed a mixture of resentment and something approximating respect for the mechanism by which she had accomplished what had seemed, in his arrogant assumption, to be an undetectable crime. Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged, and she departed the courtroom before the proceedings concluded, having obtained that she had come to obtain, which was not evidence or testimony, but rather the confirmation that her understanding of what had transpired was complete and accurate. The verdict, when it was delivered, was guilty on the charge of murder, and the sentence was life imprisonment, a consequence that Robert received with the kind of shocked understanding of a man who had never truly believed that the consequences of his actions would extend to genuine punishment. The newspapers carried extensive coverage of the trial and its conclusion, and the story of the murder at Thornfield Manor and its detection through the observations of a quiet elderly lady began to assume the quality of legend that attends such cases in small communities. Miss Marple found herself, to her considerable dismay, becoming something of a minor celebrity, with reporters attempting to interview her and neighbors regarding her methods and her insights. She responded to these inquiries with the kind of gentle deflection that suggested the entire matter had been considerably less complicated than had been represented, and that her observations had been merely the application of common sense to ordinary circumstances. What was not widely understood by those who discussed and analyzed the case was the precise nature of Miss Marple's most crucial insight. The bent porch board had indeed been significant, but not in the manner that most people assumed. Miss Marple had recognized that the bending was consistent with the application of leverage, the kind of leverage that would be employed if one wished to test whether a board could support weight applied in a particular manner, or if one wished to deliberately compromise its structural integrity without rendering it completely useless. When she had observed Timothy Ashford's cut hand and considered the timing of his presence at the fete, she had understood that the mechanism of the crime involved preparation that had extended beyond Robert's direct participation. The conspiracy had required two minds, two sets of hands, and two individual motivations that had converged upon a single objective: the removal of Gerald Thornbury and the resolution of the legal and financial complications that his presence represented. What was also not widely understood was that Miss Marple, in the course of her investigation, had come to understand something considerably more troubling about Judith Ashford and her own culpability in what had transpired. Judith had not known in advance of the conspiracy, this was true, but she had known, once informed by Timothy, under the emotional pressure of impending discovery, precisely what had occurred and precisely who had been responsible. She had, in the critical hours between the crime's commission and its official investigation, said nothing. She had allowed the false narrative of accidental death to proceed unmolested. She had protected her brother and her son through her silence, and it was only when it became clear that silence would no longer be a viable strategy that the truth had begun to emerge. Miss Marple understood this because she understood the nature of family loyalty and the manner in which it can corrupt judgment and compromise moral clarity. She said nothing of this understanding to anyone, recognizing that some truths are too complicated and too dependent upon individual circumstance to be worth the disruption that their revelation would cause. By the time autumn had fully surrendered to the approaching winter, the rhythms of St. Mary Mead had begun to re-establish themselves, though the village was not precisely the same as it had been before Gerald Thornbury's death had disrupted its comfortable continuity. There existed now an undercurrent of awareness that violence and deception could flourish beneath the surface of ordinary respectability, that the pleasant facades that communities presented to themselves could conceal motivations and actions of considerable darkness. People spoke of the matter with less frequency as the weeks progressed, but the speaking, when it did occur, carried a quality of subdued reflection rather than the shocked sensationalism that had characterized the initial discussions. The vicar preached a sermon on the nature of temptation and the manner in which financial desperation could corrupt judgment, a sermon that was understood by most of the parish to be directed obliquely at the circumstances of the Ashford family, though the vicar maintained the professional neutrality that his position required. Judith Ashford had, by this point, made the decision to lease Thornfield Manor to a family from London and to remove herself to a smaller property on the periphery of the village, a decision that was understood by those who understood such things to represent her voluntary withdrawal from the social prominence that had been associated with the manor house. She was occasionally seen in the village, purchasing provisions or attending services at the church, but she conducted herself with a kind of quiet reserve that suggested she was aware of the manner in which she was now perceived and had accepted this perception as a consequence of her family's circumstances. Miss Marple, encountering her in the village on one grey November afternoon, engaged her in a brief conversation regarding the weather and the condition of her garden, a conversation that appeared to an observer to be entirely ordinary and unremarkable. What was not apparent to an observer was the subtle communication that occurred beneath the surface of these polite exchanges, the understanding that passed between two women who recognized in each other a comprehension of complicated moral circumstances and the manner in which such circumstances resist simple judgment. It was in this context of gradually returning normalcy that Miss Marple received an unexpected letter, postmarked from the prison where Robert Ashford was serving his sentence. She opened it with the careful deliberation that she brought to all such matters, and she discovered within it a communication that was neither apology nor explanation, but rather a kind of confession addressed to her specifically, as though Robert had determined that the only person capable of understanding the precise nature of his motivations and circumstances was the person who had dismantled his carefully constructed deception. He wrote, in careful and deliberate language, of the resentment that had accumulated within him over years of observing his uncle manage properties and control wealth that Robert believed should have been his by right of inheritance, of the manner in which he had convinced himself that his actions were not truly crimes, but rather the correction of an unjust distribution of resources. He wrote of his discovery of Timothy's dissatisfaction with his own circumstances, and his recognition that Timothy's desire for financial improvement could be exploited to secure the assistance he would require. He wrote, most significantly, of the moment in which he had stood in the room with Gerald Thornbury, and realized that the older man would not be persuaded, would not be negotiated with, and would proceed with actions that would permanently forestall any possibility of Robert obtaining what he believed to be rightfully his. What Robert did not write, but what Miss Marple understood perfectly well from the manner in which he had written and the aspects of his account upon which he had elaborated, was that in the months following his arrest and imprisonment he had come to recognize the magnitude of his moral failure. The letter suggested a man who had begun the slow and painful process of understanding that no financial benefit, no matter how substantial or how justified he had convinced himself it was, could possibly warrant the destruction of another human life and the disruption of countless other lives that such destruction inevitably produced. Miss Marple did not respond to the letter, recognizing that some communications require no answer, and that the act of writing and sending such a letter might itself represent a form of reconciliation with the consequences of one's actions that was more valuable than any forgiveness that an outside party could offer. As winter deepened and Christmas approached, Miss Marple found herself engaged in the quiet domestic activities that marked the season in St. Mary Mead. She prepared her small cottage for the festive period, arranging evergreen garland and attending to the various traditions that she had observed for decades. She knitted gifts for those in the village whom she knew well, items that were practical rather than ostentatious, reflecting her understanding of what people actually needed rather than what they might claim to want. And as she engaged in these activities, her mind occasionally returned to the matter of Gerald Thornbury and the mechanism by which his death had come to be, and she reflected with the kind of contemplative sadness that age brings with it on the manner in which human nature combines capacity for both extraordinary goodness and extraordinary malevolence, and how these qualities could exist simultaneously in the same individuals, sometimes in the same moments. She understood, as few people in the village understood, that Robert Ashford had not been an evil man in any absolute sense, but rather a man whose judgment had been corrupted by desperation and resentment, who had constructed a narrative about his own righteousness that had permitted him to contemplate and ultimately to execute an act that a younger or less desperate version of himself would have considered unthinkable. She understood also that the consequences of his actions would extend far beyond his own imprisonment, affecting not only those directly involved in the crime but the entire community that had invested in narratives about itself and its members. These were the sorts of understandings that came from observing human behavior across many years and in many circumstances, and they were understandings that could be held simultaneously with both compassion for human weakness and uncompromising clarity about moral responsibility. The Christmas season arrived in St. Mary Mead with a kind of quiet beauty that characterized the village's approach to festivity, lacking the commercial ostentation that larger towns embraced, but possessed of a genuine warmth that came from long tradition and community continuity. The church held its annual Christmas Eve service, attended by most of the village's inhabitants, in the kind of observance that blended genuine religious feeling with social obligation and the comfort of familiar ritual. Miss Marple attended, as she did every year, occupying her customary pew and singing the hymns with the kind of unself-conscious participation that suggested she was more interested in the meaning of the words than in the quality of her own voice. The vicar's sermon, delivered with the careful sensitivity that the events of recent months had cultivated in him, spoke of redemption and the possibility of transformation, themes that carried particular resonance given the circumstances that the community had recently experienced. Miss Marple listened with the full attention that she brought to all such matters, recognizing in the vicar's words an attempt to provide meaning and moral framework to events that had threatened to undermine the community's sense of order and righteousness. It was in the days following Christmas that Timothy Ashford returned to the village, a development that created a peculiar tension in the community's social fabric. He had been away for some months, sent by his mother to relatives in another county, with the explicit understanding that his absence would allow time for the most intense public scrutiny of the Ashford family to diminish. His return, timed to coincide with his majority and his coming into control of certain funds that were held in trust for him, represented a kind of reintegration into the community, though the reintegration was necessarily tentative and complicated by the knowledge of his involvement in the events that had transpired. He conducted himself with a degree of humility that suggested genuine remorse, attending church services and engaging in the kind of quiet charitable work that was understood by those who understood such things to represent an attempt at moral rehabilitation. He avoided the social gatherings that might have made him welcome through the mechanism of his mother's standing, instead involving himself in activities that required neither social acceptance nor approval but merely the willingness to perform useful labor. Miss Marple encountered Timothy on a cold January afternoon, as she was returning from the village market, her basket laden with produce and provisions for the coming weeks. Timothy, recognizing her, stopped his progress along the path with the kind of awkward deference that suggested he was uncertain whether she would be willing to acknowledge him. Miss Marple, observing his hesitation, smiled with the kind of warmth that she extended to people who were struggling with genuine remorse for their actions, and she invited him to walk with H. Back to her cottage, where she offered him tea and the kind of listening presence that seemed to be what he required. Timothy's conversation, conducted in the careful language of someone who understands that his words are being weighed and evaluated, touched upon the manner in which he had been manipulated by his cousin's more sophisticated understanding of financial matters and legal complications. He spoke of the guilt that he carried for his participation in a deception that had resulted in death, and of his ongoing effort to understand how he had permitted himself to become involved in something so profoundly wrong. Miss Marple listened to all of this with the kind of patient attention that made people feel genuinely heard, and when Timothy had concluded, she offered not absolution but perspective. She spoke of the manner in which young people frequently made decisions based on incomplete understanding of consequences, and of the manner in which family loyalty could cloud judgment in ways that were difficult for individuals to recognize in themselves. She spoke also of the importance of using whatever understanding one had gained from past mistakes as a guide to future choices, and of the manner in which genuine remorse could only be demonstrated through consistent behavior over extended periods of time, rather than through words or intentions. When Timothy departed her cottage some hours later, it was with the apparent sense that he had been treated not with condemnation, but with a kind of honest assessment that came from someone who understood human nature in its full complexity. What Miss Marple did not share with Timothy, though she was aware of it with the kind of certainty that came from careful observation, was that his remorse appeared to be entirely genuine. The young man had come to recognize the magnitude of his moral failure, and this recognition seemed to be producing in him the kind of character development that suggested he might yet become someone capable of genuine contributions to his community. This was not the outcome that one might have predicted at the moment of his arrest, but Miss Marple had learned across many years that human nature possessed surprising capacity for growth and transformation, particularly when individuals were young enough to reshape their fundamental understanding of themselves and their place in the world. She recognized also that Timothy's redemption would necessarily be incomplete, that there would always be something shadowed in his history that would prevent him from ever fully escaping the consequences of his involvement in Gerald Thornbury's death, but she understood that this incompleteness was itself a form of justice that was perhaps more profound than simple punishment could ever be. In the weeks that followed, as winter gradually gave way to the earliest intimations of spring, Miss Marple continued her ordinary life with a kind of comfortable routine that characterized her existence. She maintained her garden, attended her church services, engaged in the social life of the village at the level that had always suited her, and observed the behavior of her neighbors with a kind of attentive interest that had never diminished across the decades of her residence in St. Mary Mead. The case of Gerald Thornbury's death had become, in the collective memory of the village, a kind of fixed point in time, a moment that had disrupted ordinary continuity, and then gradually receded into the past, taking on the quality of historical event rather than immediate experience. Miss Marple understood, with the clarity that comes from having observed such matters across many years, that this was precisely how communities managed their traumas and their disruptions, not by forgetting them, but by incorporating them into narrative frameworks that allowed life to continue with sufficient normality to permit the rhythms of daily existence to reassert themselves. The spring that followed the resolution of Gerald Thornbury's death came to St. Mary Mead with the kind of tentative beauty that characterized English seasons, the flowers emerging gradually from the earth as though uncertain whether it was truly safe to do so. Miss Marple tended her garden with the kind of devoted attention that she brought to all her activities, planting seeds and nurturing the early growth with the patience that comes from understanding that haste accomplishes nothing, and that the processes of nature are best served by allowing them to unfold in their own time. It was in late April, on a warm afternoon that suggested summer might not be indefinitely delayed, that she received a visitor of quite unexpected character. Detective Inspector Margaret Winters appeared at her cottage door with the bearing of someone who had come to discuss matters of conclusion rather than ongoing investigation, and Miss Marple received her with the kind of warmth that she extended to people who had proven themselves to be conscientious in the pursuit of truth. Inspector Winters came bearing information and a question, the latter of which she posed with the kind of directness that suggested she had come to understand that Miss Marple preferred clarity to circumlocution. Had Miss Marple, the inspector inquired, recognized from the beginning that Robert Ashford's guilt was certain, or had her initial observations been genuine uncertainties that had only gradually crystallized into conviction? Miss Marple considered this question with the kind of careful thought that she brought to all matters requiring precision, and she responded with characteristic honesty. She had recognized certain inconsistencies. Had suggested the matter was more complex than the obvious narrative proposed, she explained, but she had not known with certainty the identity of the guilty party until considerably later, when the accumulation of small observations had begun to form a coherent picture. The bent porch board, the misplaced walking stick, the cut on Timothy's hand, the timing of Robert's movements, the financial motivations that underlay the crime. None of these individually had proven guilt, but collectively they had suggested that someone had engaged in deliberate preparation and execution of a plan designed to appear as accident. What had been crucial, Miss Marple continued, was understanding the psychology of the perpetrator. Robert Ashford had been a man of considerable pride and considerable resentment, emotions that had accumulated across years of observing wealth and control held by others whom he believed to be less deserving than himself. He was not a man of casual impulse, but rather of deliberate calculation, which meant that once he had determined upon a course of action, he would pursue it with the kind of methodical attention that characterized his entire approach to life. The recognition of this characteristic had led Miss Marple to examine not merely what had happened, but how it had been accomplished, and how one would accomplish such a thing if one possessed Robert's particular combination of intelligence, desperation, and resentment. The mechanism of the crime had then become apparent, not a sudden act of violence, but a carefully constructed deception that had required weeks of preparation and the subtle manipulation of a younger and more malleable accomplice. Inspector Winters nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose own investigation had led to similar conclusions, and she proceeded to inform Miss Marple of certain developments that had occurred subsequent to Robert Ashford's trial and imprisonment. The case had attracted the attention of certain legal scholars who specialized in miscarriages of justice and procedural questions, and there had been discussions regarding whether certain aspects of the evidence might have been subject to challenge or alternative interpretation. However, these discussions had concluded that the evidence against Robert Ashford was sufficiently comprehensive and irrefutable that no legitimate basis existed for questioning the verdict or the sentence. Robert himself, according to correspondence that the inspector had reviewed, appeared to have accepted the finality of his situation and was engaged in the kind of quiet penitential existence that characterized long-term imprisonment. Miss Marple listened to this information with the kind of thoughtful attention that suggested she was considering not merely the facts being presented, but their implications for the broader questions of justice and morality that they raised. She observed that the law, in its infinite complexity, frequently achieved results that were roughly just even when the mechanisms by which it achieved those results were considerably less elegant or efficient than one might ideally wish. The case against Robert Ashford had been built upon careful investigation and the recognition of inconsistencies in the narrative of accident, but it had been built as well upon the fortunate circumstance that an observer with particular perceptiveness had been present at a crucial moment and had been willing to speak her observations aloud, despite the social awkwardness that such speech necessarily occasioned. As Inspector Winters prepared to depart, she ventured one final observation regarding the manner in which Miss Marple had approached the investigation. Had Miss Marple, she inquired, felt any hesitation about disrupting the comfortable assumption of accidental death and introducing into the community's consciousness the knowledge that deliberate murder had been committed within its boundaries? Miss Marple considered this question with the same careful attention that she had brought to the previous inquiry, and she responded that the truth, whatever form it took, was always preferable to comfortable falsehood, precisely because falsehood, while providing temporary comfort, ultimately undermined the foundations upon which genuine community and genuine trust could be built. The knowledge that Robert Ashford had committed murder was certainly disturbing, but the knowledge that justice had been served through the accurate understanding of what had transpired was vastly preferable to the alternative of an innocent man bearing the shadow of suspicion or a guilty man escaping consequence through the mechanism of a false narrative accepted as truth. When Inspector Winters had departed and Miss Marple had returned to her garden, she found herself reflecting on the nature of her own role in the events that had transpired. She had merely observed and reported what she had seen, and yet her observations had set in motion the machinery of investigation and ultimately of justice. She had not acted with any sense of righteousness or moral crusade, but rather with the simple conviction that truth mattered, and that falsehood, no matter how convenient or how generally accepted, remained falsehood. This conviction, refined across many years of observation and tempered by a deep understanding of human frailty and human motivation, had guided her actions throughout the investigation. As the spring afternoon faded into evening, and the stars began their emergence into the darkening sky, Miss Marple stood in her garden and allowed herself to reflect on the curious fact that in a village of pleasant ordinariness and comfortable routine, the most significant events were often those that occurred beneath the surface of ordinary perception, visible only to those who had learned to observe not merely what people said and did, but what those words and actions revealed about the fundamental nature of human desire and human motivation.